In the northeastern part of Arizona, where red rocks meet the endless sky, the Dene people, whom white people called the Navajo, had lived for centuries. Their language was ancient, complex, filled with sounds that existed in no European language. This language was passed down from generation to generation through oral histories, songs, and ceremonies, never written on paper. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Navajo people had endured tragic times. The United States government had spent decades trying to destroy their culture and language. Children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native language under threat of punishment. Teachers washed children's mouths with soap if they heard even a word of Navajo. The goal was to erase indigenous identity and turn native inhabitants into civilized Americans. But the language survived. In remote hogans, traditional Navajo dwellings, grandmothers and grandfathers continued to tell ancient stories to their grandchildren. Shepherds tending sheep among the red canyons sang the old songs. The language flowed through the people like an underground river, hidden but indestructible. In the late 1930s, the world was plunging into war again. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was conquering country after country, while in Asia, the Japanese Empire was expanding its borders with ruthless efficiency. The United States tried to stay out of it, but events were unfolding rapidly. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The news reached the Navajo reservations a few days later, spreading from hogan to hogan, from trading post to trading post. Young Navajo men, raised in poverty and discrimination, faced a choice. Many of them had never left the reservation. Some did not have U.S. citizenship, as Native Americans had only received it in 1924. Most lived without electricity or running water, in dugouts and hogans, herding sheep and growing corn on arid land. They were among the poorest citizens of the world's wealthiest country. And yet, when the country called them to war, thousands of Navajo answered. They enlisted as volunteers, sometimes walking dozens of miles to the nearest recruitment station. Some were only 15 or 16 years old and lied about their age to get into the military. They went to defend a country that had taken their land, their children, and their language. Among these volunteers were tall, lean teenagers from the reservations, young men with long black hair that would soon be cut in training camps. They spoke English poorly, many seeing the ocean and big cities for the first time. But a fire burned within them, the ancient warrior tradition of their people, for whom defending their land was a sacred duty. In Los Angeles lived a man named Philip Johnston. He was white, the son of Protestant missionaries, but his childhood had been spent on the Navajo reservation. His parents had dedicated their lives to converting Native Americans to Christianity, and little Philip grew up among Navajo children, played with them, and learned their language. By age 10, he spoke Navajo as fluently as English. Now Philip was 50 years old, working as an engineer and closely following the war's development. He knew that in World War I, the American military had used members of the Choctaw tribe to transmit coded messages. The Germans had never been able to decipher these messages. But after the war, German scholars studied the Choctaw language, and now that code was useless. Johnston understood that the Navajo language was completely different. It was one of the most complex languages in the world, with no written form, a unique grammatical structure, and sounds that were nearly impossible for Europeans to reproduce. Outside the American Southwest, practically no one knew it. In the entire world, including Japan and Germany, there was perhaps not a single person, except for Navajo and a few missionaries, who could speak it. In February 1942, Johnston arrived at Camp Elliott, a Marine base near San Diego. He requested a meeting with command and presented his idea: to use Navajo as code talkers, creating an unbreakable code based on their native language. The officers were skeptical. Native Americans were considered unreliable, uneducated, and incapable of complex military work. But Johnston was persistent. He brought several Navajo who lived in Los Angeles and arranged a demonstration. Officers gave them messages in English. The Navajo translated them into their language and transmitted them to each other, then translated them back into English. The process was fast, accurate, and the listening officers didn't understand a word. Marine Command was impressed but remained cautious. They authorized an experiment. 30 Navajo needed to be recruited for a special project. The requirements were strict. Candidates had to be fluent in both Navajo and English, physically healthy, and reliable. But most importantly, they had to create the code itself. In the spring of 1942, recruiters arrived at the Navajo reservation. News of the special assignment spread quickly. Young men lined up, hoping to be selected. Many were rejected due to insufficient knowledge of English or health problems. The reservation was poor, nutrition was scarce, and many potential recruits suffered from tuberculosis or malnutrition. By May, 29 men had been selected. The youngest was 15, having lied about his age. The oldest was 36. Most were teenagers or in their early 20s, thin guys from the reservation who had spent their lives herding sheep and working in fields. Some had never seen a train. For most, this was their first trip outside the reservation. They were sent to Camp Pendleton, a massive Marine base in California. There, a harsh shock awaited them. Marine training camp was known as the toughest in the American Armed Forces. Instructors yelled at recruits, made them run until exhausted, crawl under barbed wire, and march for hours under the scorching sun. The Navajo performed better than many. They had grown up in the harsh desert, were accustomed to physical exertion and long treks across rough terrain. Many could run all day without stopping, a traditional skill of their people. But the psychological pressure was new and brutal. Instructors mocked their accents, called them offensive names, and doubted their abilities. The 29 stuck together. In the evenings, when other recruits went their separate ways, the Navajo gathered apart. They spoke in their language, shared food, and supported each other. They were bound by more than just origin. They were bound by a mission about which they still knew little. After basic training, they were taken to a separate room and given their task. They were to create a military code based on the Navajo language. This code had to be fast, accurate, and impossible for the enemy to decipher. Thousands of lives could depend on their work. The task was enormous. The Navajo language had no words for modern military equipment. There were no terms for tanks, aircraft, submarines, grenades, or machine guns. The 29th had to create an entire military vocabulary from scratch, using only their ancient language. They began working. Day and night, they sat in a stuffy room, discussing, arguing, and proposing options. They decided to use images from their world to designate military equipment. Aircraft became birds. A bomber was called Jaysho, meaning buzzard. A fighter became Dahi-Tihi, hummingbird. Submarines were called Beshlo, iron fish. Tanks became turtles. Grenades turned into potatoes. To transmit the alphabet, they created a system where each letter was designated by a Navajo word. A became Wolachi, ant. B became Shush, bear. C became Moasi, cat. This way, any names could be transmitted by spelling them out through animals and objects. They worked for months, testing the code, perfecting it, memorizing hundreds of terms. Everything had to be kept in memory. Nothing was written down. If any of them were captured, there should be no notes in their pockets, no evidence. The code had to exist only in their heads. By August 1942, the code was ready. The vocabulary included over 250 military terms, and the system was constantly expanding. The 29 passed final tests, transmitting complex combat orders in seconds without a single error. Machines required hours to encode and decode the same messages. Japanese cryptographers, considered the best in the world, didn't have the slightest chance of deciphering this code. The war in the Pacific was particularly brutal. Japanese forces had captured vast territories, from China to the southern Pacific Islands. The American strategy consisted of slowly advancing island by island, recapturing each piece of land in bloody battles. The Japanese fought fanatically, preferring death to surrender, turning each island into a fortress. The Marines led the offensive, and with each wave of Marines storming beaches under enemy fire, Navajo Code Talkers went with them. They carried heavy radio equipment on their backs, often weighing over 45 pounds. In combat, they had to stay in communication, transmitting critically important messages between commanders, coordinating artillery strikes, and calling for reinforcements. The first combat use of the code occurred on Guadalcanal in late 1942. 6 Navajo were sent to this remote island in the southern Solomon Islands, where Americans and Japanese were fighting for control of a strategic airfield. The jungle was dense, humid, full of malarial mosquitoes and Japanese snipers. The Navajo were positioned at different points along the front line, maintaining constant radio communication. When the Japanese began an offensive, messages flew through the air in Navajo. Japanese radio operators intercepted the transmissions, but heard only an incomprehensible stream of strange sounds, unlike any language they knew. They recorded the transmissions and sent them to their best cryptographers. The experts were at a loss. The code worked flawlessly. Messages were transmitted at the speed of normal conversation, with no need to waste time on encoding. An officer could give an order to a Navajo code talker in English, who would instantly translate it into coded Navajo and transmit it by radio. On the other end, a Navajo would receive the message, translate it back into English, and relay it to the commander. The entire process took 20 seconds where machines required 30 minutes. Marine Command was amazed by the results. They immediately requested more Navajo. The program was expanded. By the end of the war, about 400 Navajo served as code talkers in the Marines. Each island was hell. Tarawa, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, had been fortified by the Japanese so strongly that American command considered it impregnable. In November 1943, the Marines stormed the island. The Navajo went in the first waves. The beaches were littered with bodies. Japanese fire cut down Marines as soon as they left the landing craft. The Navajo, carrying heavy radio equipment, were especially vulnerable. They couldn't quickly take cover, couldn't drop the equipment. Some died before reaching shore. Others fell on the sand, riddled with bullets, and their comrades picked up the radios and continued the mission. Those who survived dug in and began working. Under continuous fire, in heat and dust, they transmitted message after message. They coordinated artillery fire from ships, called in airstrikes, and transmitted information about Japanese troop movements. Their voices, calm and clear, sounded in the radio waves in an ancient language that now served as a weapon in the most modern war. Tarawa was taken in 76 hours. Over 1,000 Americans died, and nearly all 5,000 Japanese defenders were killed. Officers unanimously acknowledged that without the Navajo, the battle would have taken much longer and cost many more lives. Then came Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. Each island brought the war closer to Japan. Each island was harder than the previous one. The Japanese fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing they were defending the last line before their home islands. On Guam in July 1944, the Navajo worked around the clock, transmitting over 800 messages in the first 3 days of fighting. Not a single message was lost. Not one was misunderstood. In conventional warfare, this would have been an incredible statistic. When using machine encryption, there were always errors, delays, and garbled transmissions. The Navajo worked flawlessly. They became legendary. Commanders demanded that Navajo be assigned to their units. Officers who had initially doubted the Native Americans now refused to go into battle without them. One general stated that he would rather have 1 Navajo than 10 regular radio operators. But the price was high. Navajo died. Some from enemy fire, others from diseases that ravaged troops in the tropics. Many were wounded, sometimes multiple times, but returned to the front after hospitalization. They felt a sense of responsibility. Each of them was irreplaceable because only he knew the code. If he didn't return, who would take his place? In February 1945, American forces prepared to storm Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island 500 miles from Japan. The island was strategically important as a base for escort fighters that could protect bombers attacking Japanese cities. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress, digging miles of tunnels and fortifications into the volcanic rock. The Fifth Fleet approached the island on February 19th. Navajo were distributed across all Marine units preparing for the landing. Some of them had served together since the first days on Guadalcanal. They were veterans who had seen so much death and destruction that nothing could surprise them anymore. But Iwo Jima proved worse than anything they knew. The landing began in the morning. The Japanese allowed the first waves of Marines to come ashore almost without resistance, then opened devastating fire. The beach turned into a slaughter. Bodies lay everywhere. The wounded cried for help. The Navajo, as always, couldn't seek cover. They had to establish communication. They dug into the black volcanic sand and began working. Messages poured in a continuous stream. Each unit reported its position. Commanders coordinated attacks. Artillery requested target designation. Medics called for evacuation of the wounded. All of this went in the Navajo language, fast, clear, continuous. In the first 48 hours of fighting on Iwo Jima, the Navajo transmitted over 800 messages. Not one contained an error. Major Howard Connor, signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, would later say that without the Navajo, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The battle lasted 36 days. It was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. Over 20,000 were wounded. Virtually all 21,000 Japanese defenders died, refusing to surrender. The Navajo worked every day of the battle, under fire, in foxholes, often without sleep or food, transmitting messages that saved their comrades' lives. The most famous moment of the battle was the photograph of raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. There are no Navajo in that photograph, but they were there, down below, on the beach, in the foxholes, transmitting the orders that made that ascent possible. The last great battle of the Pacific War was Okinawa. This large island was only 350 miles from Japan and was to become a staging ground for an invasion of the main islands. The battle began on April 1st, 1945, and continued for nearly 3 months. The Navajo were everywhere. Their numbers had grown to several hundred, and they served in practically every major Marine unit. Okinawa was an especially complex operation, requiring coordination of massive forces across a large territory. The Japanese employed new tactics, using kamikaze pilots and mass suicide attacks. The Code Talkers worked under incredible conditions. Rains turned the island into a sea of mud. Japanese snipers hunted officers and radio operators. The Navajo often became targets because they carried distinctive radio equipment. Many were killed or wounded. But those who remained continued working. By this time, the code had expanded to over 600 terms. The Navajo could transmit the most complex combat orders, coordinate actions of air, naval, and ground forces, all in their ancient language. The Japanese never managed to decipher a single message. Their cryptographers were desperate. They intercepted thousands of transmissions but understood not a word. There were moments of dark humor. Once, the Japanese captured a Navajo named Joe Kiyomiya. They discovered he was from the Navajo tribe and brought their translators who had studied Native American languages to him. The translators listened to intercepted radio transmissions and asked Kiyomiya to translate. Kiyomiya listened and understood nothing. He spoke Navajo but wasn't a code talker and didn't know the military code. The Japanese decided he was pretending and tortured him. Kiyomiya survived but was never able to help them because he truly didn't know the code. Okinawa fell in June 1945. The casualties were horrific on both sides. Over 12,000 Americans died, including the highest-ranking officer killed in combat in the entire war. The Japanese lost over 100,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians. The war was approaching its end. An invasion of the main Japanese islands was planned, an operation that promised to be the bloodiest in history. The Navajo prepared for this invasion. But in August, 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over. When the war ended, the Navajo began returning home. Some had served for 3 years, going through all the major battles in the Pacific. They had seen things that changed them forever. They had seen friends die. They had seen destruction, suffering, and the cruelty of war. Many carried physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. But they couldn't talk about their service. The Navajo Code Talker program remains strictly classified. The Marines plan to use the same code in future wars. The Navajo received orders to never, under any circumstances, speak about what they had done. They couldn't tell parents, wives, or children. They had to keep silent. They returned to the reservation, where life had barely changed. The same poverty, the same problems. Many suffered from what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then no one knew about it or treated it. They woke up at night screaming, had nightmares, couldn't forget the war. Some turned to alcohol. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming silent and detached. The Navajo conducted purification ceremonies for warriors returning from war. These were ancient rituals designed to restore harmony and wash away the contamination of death. Medicine men sang songs passed down through generations, used sacred herbs and symbols. These ceremonies helped some veterans find peace. But for most, life was difficult. They were heroes whom no one knew about. They had won the war in a way no one could talk about. Their contribution to victory was enormous, but invisible. They received thanks from commanders, medals for bravery in combat. But the true nature of their service remained secret. Years passed. The 1950s, the 1960s. The Navajo aged. Some died, taking their secrets with them. The younger generation didn't know what their fathers and grandfathers had done in the war. The old men couldn't explain why they sometimes fell silent, staring into emptiness, remembering distant islands and fallen comrades. In 1968, 23 years after the end of the war, the Navajo Code Talker program was finally declassified. The Marines decided the code was no longer needed for future conflicts. Technology had changed. New encryption methods had appeared. The ancient Navajo language was no longer a military secret. The news spread slowly. The Navajo who had kept silent for decades could finally tell their stories. Some spoke readily, glad to share their experiences. Others remained silent, unwilling to stir up old memories. Many had already died, never living to see recognition. Historians began studying the program. Journalists wrote articles. Slowly, very slowly, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers became known. People learned about young men from the reservation who used their language. That very language the government had tried to destroy, to defend their country. There was deep irony in this. The Navajo language, which had been banned in schools, for which children were punished and humiliated, turned out to be the key to victory. The culture they had tried to erase had saved thousands of lives. The Navajo, considered second-class citizens, proved to be irreplaceable warriors. Recognition came late, but it came. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as Navajo Code Talkers Day. Veterans were invited to Washington, where they received certificates of appreciation. It was a touching event. Old men in traditional jewelry and gray hair stood at the ceremony, remembering their youth and the war. But true recognition came later. In 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a law to award the Navajo Code Talkers with medals. The original 29, those who created the code, were to receive Congressional Gold Medals, the country's highest civilian honor. The other program participants received silver medals. By this time, many were no longer alive. The award ceremony took place in July 2001 at the Capitol. 4 of the original 29 were still alive and attended the ceremony. The remaining medals were received by their families. It was a moment of triumph and sadness. Triumph because recognition had finally come. Sadness because it came too late for most. Today, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers is known around the world. In the Navajo Reservation, there are museums and monuments dedicated to them. Schools teach their history. The younger generation of Navajo knows about the heroes of their people. The last of the original 29, Chester Nez, died in 2014 at the age of 93. Until the end of his life, he told the story of young men from the reservation who went to war with radios and an ancient language. He spoke of camaraderie, of fear, of pride in work well done. He spoke of the language that saved them and saved the country. The story of the Code Talkers is important not just as military history. It's a story about the power of culture, about the value of diversity, about how what seems like a weakness can become the greatest strength. The Navajo language survived centuries of colonization, decades of repression, and deliberate attempts at destruction. It survived, and at a critical moment in history, it proved invaluable. It's also a story about the contradictions of American history. The Navajo defended a country that had oppressed their people for centuries. They fought for freedom abroad when their own freedom was limited at home. They proved their loyalty to a country that had doubted their humanity. After the war, the situation for Native Americans slowly began to improve. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought more rights and recognition. Native languages, including Navajo, were no longer suppressed but began to be preserved and studied. Today, Navajo remains one of the most widely spoken Native American languages in the United States, with about 170,000 speakers. The Navajo Code Talkers became a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and patriotism, but also a symbol of the resilience of indigenous peoples, their ability to survive, adapt, and preserve their identity in the face of enormous hardship. Military historians agree that the Navajo Code was the only code from World War II that was never broken by the enemy. The Japanese, whose cryptographers were considered among the best in the world, intercepted thousands of messages in Navajo. They recorded them, analyzed them, and tried to find patterns. Some transmissions reached German experts. No one even came close to deciphering it. This was an achievement not only military but also cultural. A language created by people who had lived in the deserts of the American Southwest for centuries proved to be an impenetrable barrier to the most advanced cryptographic methods of the 20th century. Traditional knowledge defeated modern science. Antiquity defeated modernity. In the Navajo reservation, among red rocks and endless sky, the wind still whispers in the ancient language. Elders still tell stories, passing knowledge to new generations. The language continues to live, evolve, adapt to a new world, but preserving its essence. When young Navajo study their language today, they're learning more than just words and grammar. They're learning a history of survival. They're learning the language that withstood attempts at destruction and became a weapon of victory. They're learning the legacy of warriors who spoke with the wind and changed the course of history. The Navajo Code Talkers served from 1942 to 1945. About 400 men went through the program. 13 died in combat. Many were wounded. All were changed by the experience of war. They returned home as different people, carrying a burden of memories they couldn't share for decades. The Navajo call themselves Dene, which means the people. This simple word carries deep meaning, an assertion of identity, belonging, and continuity. The Code Talkers were part of this people, a continuation of an ancient warrior tradition adapted to modern warfare. They were a bridge between the old and the new, between tradition and modernity. Their voices, which spoke with the wind through radio waves over the Pacific Ocean, are now silent. The last veteran has passed, taking living memories of those days with him. But their story lives on. It lives in museums and monuments, in books and films, in the hearts of the Navajo people. And it lives in the language itself. Every time someone speaks Navajo, pronounces the ancient words, passes them on to children, the language continues to live. This is the true victory of the Code Talkers. They not only helped win the war, they showed the world the value of their culture, their language, their people. They proved that the Navajo, their traditions, and their language have a place in the modern world.